Hi, I'm John Raffensperger. I'm an operations researcher. I apply math to hard decision problems. I've got a couple ideas about climate change. First, I'm going to propose a coalition of private firms to start a disciplined cap-and-trade institution. Second, I'm going to propose a state-of-art auction mechanism to cap warming with a target date to end it. If you care about climate change, I invite you to stay and listen. There's a lot of common questions about climate change. First, what climate change technology will end global warming for us? Will it be fake meat? Would it be geoengineering? Maybe fusion? I don't know anyone who can tell us. What's the best price for a ton of carbon dioxide? Is it $10 a ton? Is it $50 a ton? Is it $100 a ton? Again, I don't know anyone who can tell us. Why can't governments end global warming? Perhaps by putting a price on carbon. Well, it turns out we actually kind of know the answer to this. I'll talk about it later. But most importantly, when will global warming end? Will that be in 2050, in 2080, in 500 years? That is, when will the global average temperature be back to where it was 100 years ago? Are we going to leave this terrible crisis to our great-grandchildren? Here's the outline for my presentation. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to atmospheric warming. In part one, I'm going to talk about the need for mass sequestration, and I'm going to talk about why governments have had such trouble solving this problem. Then I'm going to talk about a coalition of firms, how this coalition could start a disciplined cap-and-trade institution. And I'm going to talk about how this institution could use a state-of-art auction mechanism to end global warming by a target date. So here's a graph that shows the warming from 1 megaton of carbon dioxide emitted today. The graph shows the warming over time. You can see that it starts small and then rises. It doesn't seem like much. The curve goes out on this graph 100 years, but in fact it goes out much longer. This graph shows 3 pulses of carbon dioxide. One now, one emitted in 10 years, and one emitted in 20 years. It's 3 versions of the previous graph added together and shifted by 10 years. So we end up with these 3 bumps. Of course, we could remove a ton of carbon dioxide. That would be great. That would in fact cool the atmosphere. Carbon regulators find these curves a little bit too complicated to use, so they'll often simplify them into a metric called global warming potential. Global warming potential is just the area under these curves for some fixed number of years. Here it's for 100 years. And then they define that global warming potential equal to 1 when defined for carbon dioxide. Here's the warming curve for carbon dioxide with methane, CH4. And you can see that the curve for methane is much larger than the curve for carbon dioxide. It has a different shape too. It starts with a very high peak and then falls. The area under this curve is 28 times the area on the carbon dioxide curve over 100 years. And so the global warming potential for methane is 28. Now you can use the global warming potential to convert prices. So if you know the price for carbon dioxide, you just multiply it by the GWP for methane, and you get the price to emit a ton of methane. Here I've converted the methane curve to a bar chart. So rather than a smooth curve, these are now discrete values that you could type into a spreadsheet. This curve shows the warming graphs for 9 different greenhouse gases. I've had to change the axis to a logarithm just because they have such different effects. The worst of these, sulfur hexafluoride SF6 at the top, actually has a global warming potential of 23,500. It's pretty bad for the environment. While these curves have different heights, they also have different shapes. So the warming effects have different timings. If we really care about this problem, probably global warming potential oversimplifies it. We need to take into account the shapes of these curves as well as their heights. Enough about atmospheric physics. In part one, I'm going to talk about the need to lower emissions, to offset remaining emissions, and to eliminate excess carbon dioxide. And I'm going to explain why governments haven't been able to do this. So here's what we hope for with the Paris Accords. The emissions have been increasing over time. We hope to get down to net zero by 2050. What that means is what we emit minus what we sequester gets to 0. If we can do that, carbon dioxide we continue to put into the atmosphere will level off. The total inventory will cease to increase. And if we can do that, global temperature will level off as well. The goal for the Paris Accords is 2 degrees Celsius. But if we work really hard, we could keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But in fact, we're on track to go to 2.5 degrees Celsius. Now, what we really should be doing is we should be carbon negative, where we start taking carbon dioxide out of the air. And if we did that, we would draw down the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we did that, the global average temperature could fall. We could put it back to where it was, say, 100 years ago. I think that the Paris Accords is likely to fail, and I'll show you why. And yet, I'm going to propose a way to do the harder goal of actually becoming carbon negative and actually reducing the global temperature back to what it was 100 years ago. So it seems like I'm saying the easy goal is impossible, and the harder goal is actually more plausible. The problem of making these top-down treaties has very high transaction costs. You have to get together hundreds of senior government leaders in one place, and they do a great many-to-many discussion and negotiation to try and solve this problem. And once you get to an agreement, they have to go home and they have to sell their own governments on it. And as a result, these things don't happen very often, and the decisions aren't all that great. They get watered down. So there's no prospect of a disciplined global mechanism. We really don't know when global warming is going to end. There's no plan for putting in a global cap and trade or a global tax to solve the problem. John Nash, pictured here, might offer a reason for the lack of an international treaty on global warming. Let's think about the problem of an international treaty from our point of view as a country. If we all do nothing, we all lose 100. This is the worst case that we're trying to avoid. Now, since I care about the climate, I might try to do something. In this case, we all burn again. They all lose 100, but I actually lose 101 because I tried to help and it cost me more, but we still all lost. Of course, we could all work together. In this case, we all lose a little bit. We all lose the cost of solving the problem, but at least we don't all burn. This is the solution we want. Look what happens if I do nothing. They can all solve the problem without me because they're the majority. If I don't help, if I do nothing, then I actually come out ahead because I'll have a competitive edge while they do all the work. So they lose a little more, but I actually win. If you look at these different outcomes for myself, my best solution is to do nothing. I come out ahead, and they're chumps. Since everybody sees this, since everybody knows these outcomes, then nobody does ever anything. And the result is we all do nothing, and we actually end up with the second outcome of where we all burn. The Nash equilibrium is that no one helps. Everyone does nothing. John Nash's theory doesn't explain all reasons we lack a global warming treaty, but it does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of it. I hope I'm wrong, but this suggests that we will never get to a disciplined mechanism through global negotiation. As a result, only about 25% of global emissions are capped or taxed. This is pretty sad, given that we've known about climate change for over half a century. And surprisingly, people around the world who have implemented cap and trade systems, like the European Union and California, have almost no carbon sequestration. Their cap and trade systems do reduce emissions somewhat, but they use most of the money for non-specific environmental causes, for general government purposes, not for planting forests or for changing agricultural practices to offset the gases they still emit. And as I'll explain later, they have various reasons for doing this. But sequestration on a mass scale isn't happening, even where carbon is capped or taxed. And the major policy proposals ignore sequestration. For example, George Shultz, Donald Rumsfeld, other prominent Republicans proposed a carbon tax with a carbon dividend. With the money from emissions taxes, the U.S. government would pay every citizen $500 a year. Sounds great, like we're going to make money on global warming. This proposal would reduce emissions somewhat, 20 to 40%. How much exactly, we don't know. The mechanism sets a price, but it doesn't set a quantity cap. Further, this carbon tax doesn't offset the remaining emissions, which will continue. Worse still, the carbon tax does nothing about the excess carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. And the tax money being given to citizens actually increases consumption, which is going to increase emissions at the margin. This graph from 2012 shows U.S. emissions under various tax fees with different rates of growth in those fees. The uncertainty here isn't about forecasting the weather. It's not scientific uncertainty. The uncertainty is what we're going to do about it. What will the tax be? It's management uncertainty. And the existing cap and trade systems reduce management uncertainty somewhat, but not nearly enough. Their regulators often cave to political pressure. If the cap is too low, they want to put in a price floor. If the price goes too high, they want to put in a price cap. They let companies buy credits today and bank them for future emissions. They use simplified global warming potentials as metrics. Together, these shortcomings prevent management certainty about ending global warming. I already mentioned their lack of sequestration and lack of global coverage. I don't like criticizing the existing cap and trade systems. Good people are trying to do complicated policy with difficult politics. They're much better than doing nothing, but it's not working very well. The EU system doesn't even cap methane. So we end up with graphs like this, showing different scenarios of RCP, representative concentration pathways. The scenarios differ in what we will choose to do about global warming. Again, these scenarios are not about scientific uncertainty, but management uncertainty. We need to know when global warming will end. We need a way to set the global temperature in some future year t back to what it was in 1920 or before. I've invented a way to do this, and I'll show it to you. But first we need a way to implement it. I'm going to propose to you a faster path to implementation of a global cap and trade mechanism. The idea starts with the observation that companies are the agents who must reduce emissions. Companies are the key players in the whole problem. When we talk taxes or cap and trade, companies would be the ones paying the tax or buying the emissions permits. And they differ in their willingness to reduce emissions. Many companies are skeptical of climate change, and some continue even to gaslight us. Yet many large, important firms want to help solve the problem. They're working to measure their emissions and to reduce their carbon footprints. So companies differ in their willingness to help. Further, it's a small transaction cost to get one company to commit to a carbon reduction deal. I mean, small compared to getting a country to commit. Bottom-up solutions have lower transaction costs than top-down solutions. Bloomberg last December reported on Sony's demand for clean electrons. This heritage Japanese company told their government they may have to relocate factories out of Japan because Japan doesn't have enough renewable power. That's an amazing commitment from an eminent company. And they're not alone. So here's how this faster path would work. In step 1, a coalition of willing private firms starts a disciplined cap and trade institution. The private firms want to get certified green by buying their permits from their emissions. The new institution has a special rule. You get certified only if your suppliers buy permits for their emissions. So think of Apple wanting to get green certification. Tim Cook might go to Foxconn and say, we want you to buy permits for your emissions, and we're willing to increase prices on the iPhones to make it happen. This creates a bit of a threat for Foxconn that Apple could get a different supplier if Foxconn doesn't go along. But it also reduces the cost risk for Foxconn because they know Apple will support them in it. So here you can see at the bottom left a schematic of the process by which participation flows through the supply chain, regardless of country. At bottom right, you can see green countries with green firms within, and gray countries with non-participating firms. And yet because of the supply chain, some countries that are not green have green firms within them. And there's a huge value proposition in this for business, because buying permits is way easier than moving factories or building solar energy systems. You're buying the cheapest solution on the open market rather than building your own solution. A market mechanism will be way cheaper than blunt government regulations. With the new administration in Washington, we could see a whole range of expensive climate change regulations. Those regulations will reduce emissions, but I don't see how they're going to offset emissions, nor draw down the existing carbon dioxide already in the air. And so this mechanism's likely to be much better for the Earth, because the auction manager will be paying to plant forests, rebuild mangroves, and change agricultural practices. Step 2 in this faster path happens when jurisdictions start to require firms within to participate. Since implementation is happening across jurisdictions already, a governor may find that joining is easy politically because firms there are already participating. So this process is going to move forward in a way that joining gets easier and quitting gets harder. This appears to be the opposite of the Nash equilibrium I showed you earlier. Instead of everyone's best action being to stay out, this faster path shows strong evidence of a rush to join. In step 3, consumers pressure firms and countries to participate. Because this mechanism is centralized, they could blockchain every can of soup. You scan it with your phone in the store, and it shows whether the producers have paid for the emissions on it. I've done some preliminary simulations on this faster path mechanism. These simulations suggest it does have a rush to join as long as each firm requires participation of its suppliers and its customers. That is, Apple requires Foxconn to participate. Foxconn also requires Apple to participate. It looks like participation would spread globally. I'm going to tell you how a cap and trade system could target a date to end global warming, maybe in 50 years. That means my children could see the end of it. To do this, we need a price on warming. So suppose Apple, Microsoft, BMW, and Ford, hypothetically, join together to set up this cap and trade institution with these stern rules about green certification. Imagine they hire a manager to run it. Let's call her Greta. Greta operates a monthly auction. She's selling permits to businesses for the right to emit greenhouse gases. She's also buying contracts to sequester carbon dioxide. So here's the bidder's webpage. It's pretty simple. It has a drop-down box for the type of greenhouse gas, a date selector for the month when the company wants to emit their gas, August in this case. Hey, I did my paper back in 2020. Their maximum price bid for per kiloton here, $115, and the number of kilotons they want to buy. Here, 80 kilotons. They type that in and they click submit. The company is called Emissora de Gas Limited. From their point of view, it's easy. People who want to sell a contract to plant a forest would have a similar web page. Now, for those of you math types, I've got the algebraic terms here. I'm going to use the subscript A for the agent, Emissora de Gas in this case. I'm going to use the subscript P for the emission action, polluting or planting. I'm going to use subscript U and T for the emissions time period. I'm going to use capital B for the maximum bid price and capital Q for the maximum quantity. Earlier, I showed you this curve of methane warming. I'm going to name this W because we're going to need this parameter in the optimization. It's the degrees warming in a future period T from a kilogram emission in period U. This converts the mass of an emission today to degrees Celsius in the future. So Greta chooses bids with a linear program. Linear programming is a 74-year-old technology. The algorithm was invented by George Dantzig back in 1947. The algorithm's easy for an operations researcher, like fixing a light switch for an electrician or changing the oil for a mechanic. It's routine math. Businesses everywhere use linear programming for managing logistics, scheduling employees, and planning production. The high bidder for emissions permits wins. That is, the bidder can emit a greenhouse gas only if doing so is valuable enough for the economy. The low bidder for sequestration wins. That is, Greta gives the bidder a contract to sequester only if the bidder can do it cheaply enough. If someone comes up with the technology to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at $500 a ton, and somebody else offers a sequestration contract for planting mangroves at $15 a ton, Greta should not accept the bid for $500 a ton. She should accept the bid for $15 a ton because it's going to be better for the economy. And this mix of bids must satisfy a constraint on warming using these W factors I've been showing you. George Dantzig's algorithm automatically produces the correct price on warming. So this mechanism is a cap and trade on warming. In this example, the constraint on warming requires global temperature to fall by 1 degree Celsius by the year 2070. And then global warming would be over. So here's the linear programming. If linear programming is not your thing, please feel free to skip ahead. A, as I said, is the agent. P is the subscript for the activity, polluting or planting. T and U are the subscripts for the time periods, the month. The data, capital B is the bid price for the agent. capital Q, the maximum amount they wanted to buy. W is the warming curve. The decisions, little q, is kilograms allocated to agent A, is the key decision that Greta has to make to decide who wins each bid for the auction. The variable little v is just the total activity over the agents A. And pi is the market price, the dollars per unit of each activity. Now the model, which I call SM damage. First, Greta maximizes the money she gets from emissions permits, minus the money she has to pay for sequestration contracts. Some of these capital B parameters are positive, the ones she's selling to corporations to emit, and some of them are negative, the ones where she has to pay contracts to sequester carbon dioxide. So from her point of view, she's maximizing her profit. Second, she shouldn't allocate more than quantity Q, the maximum quantity that each agent wants. Third, variable V just sums up the activities of polluting or planting by type. The market price on this period in this activity is the shadow price, the dual price, the Lagrangian, pi pt. Danzig's algorithm calculates it automatically. Fourth, this constraint drives everything. It says that the warming from emissions has to be less than -1 degrees Celsius from the year 2070 forwards. If we did this, global warming could be over by the year 2070. The price on warming is the shadow price, dual price, Lagrangian for you math people out there, omega t. The algorithm calculates it automatically. Because people can bid on future permits and sequestration contracts, the auction produces a complete schedule, which means the algorithm gives prices by month out 150 years into the future. Of course, these prices are likely to change at every monthly auction, but it's a lot more information than business people have now about future carbon prices. So Greta solves the optimization model to pick the winning bids. Then she updates the bidders' web pages. Here you see the bid conclusion for Emissora de Gas Limited. They got their 80 kilotons at a price of $112.50, which is actually a bit lower than they bid. One of the rules is that the permit expires if the bidder doesn't use it in the selected month. There's no banking. This eliminates management uncertainty about warming. Emissora de Gas can buy it well in advance. So if they're planning out a year and they decide they don't need so much before the due date, they can offer it back to the market. Of course, the price may not be the same, but at least they're not locked in. Here are some prices from one simulated auction. I'm showing them by decade, but the auction produces prices for every month. Notice the changes in prices over time. There's no one fixed correct price. Prices must be dynamic due to the physics of warming. And using global warming potential to convert prices must be wrong because the ratios of prices change over time. Here you can see the price of sulfur hexafluoride divided by the price of carbon dioxide. The ratio changes from 5,000 to 6,500 to 7,100. Using a fixed value for global warming potential will result in the wrong prices. I bet the schedule of prices would be of great interest to someone working on fusion or a carbon capture device. To be clear, I'm not forecasting these prices. I'm suggesting what the prices could be at the very cheapest if we implement this mechanism now. If we use cruder, bad climate change policies, we have to pay more, possibly much more. We can take the shortest route from here to there, or we can take any of a great many expensive long ways around. Now the global economy has a powerful price mechanism for carbon. This pricing mechanism can serve as the umpire for all the global warming technologies. It doesn't exclude fusion or carbon capture. It just umpires those solutions with precision. And this mechanism directly targets the policy problem of warming. You may notice I've been saying global warming instead of the phrase climate change. That's because climate change refers to a wide array of effects of global warming, including fire and sea level rise and flooding. This mechanism targets only global temperature. It doesn't try to do anything else. So the cost to solve global warming with this mechanism is likely lower than any other solution. It doesn't try to solve the problem of equity, or the housing shortage, or water problems. Now, I care about these issues. In my view, we should solve them directly. For example, Reparations would be a direct solution for solving some historical problems of equity disparities. We should use a precision tool for a given policy problem. Our auction manager, Greta, has a problem with revenue. Buyers of permits pay to offset their own warming effects. They don't pay to draw down the excess carbon dioxide in the air because that excess was already there. But that warming constraint in the optimization obligates Greta to buy contracts to sequester carbon dioxide enough to lower the global temperature. So she will actually be revenue negative, on the hook, in the hole, out of the pocket, for all the carbon we've already put into the air. This graph shows how much out of pocket, assuming we started the auction in 2020, because that's when I finished my paper. The graph shows that solving global warming by the year 2040 could cost almost $40 trillion if we start now. Solving global warming by the year 2050 would cost about $20 trillion if we start now. Solving global warming by 2080 to 2090 would be about $10 trillion, again, assuming we start now. I'm not saying where that money would come from, and this isn't a problem with the mechanism. This mechanism merely calculates the minimum cost. The Biden administration is starting to toss around numbers like $10 trillion in discussions about climate change, and that's just for the US. So this actually looks plausible. We're adding 50 gigatons, maybe $600 billion every year to this. I used open source data to create the simulation. It could be misestimated in a number of different ways. I would guess that the cost of solving global warming is much less because this work can't account for other changes in people's behaviors or new technologies or the many hidden ways we could reduce emissions at very low cost. What could go wrong? Carbon sequestration has a lot of moral hazard in it, like clearing a forest to get paid to plant it, or planting a forest that was going to get planted anyway, or taking money to plant a forest and not planting it. The Nature Conservancy has recently been criticized for this in the news. This is partly why cap and trade mechanisms don't do sequestration. We need strong sequestration contracts. Fortunately, the technology is getting better at this. The image here at the bottom right is from April 1st, 2021. It's a new drone to detect methane leaks at high speed and precision. We have near real-time databases now tracking forests. A greater moral hazard would be not trying to sequester carbon because we're afraid of the moral hazard of sequestering carbon. Governments with existing emission systems may not want to give up their revenue. I don't know how to get past this. The coalition of private companies would have to negotiate with these governments. I've thought of a variety of other problems with this mechanism, but all seem surmountable. If you think of any, please let me know. To end global warming, we need to reduce emissions, we need to offset the remaining emissions, and we need to draw down the existing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So ending global warming requires mass sequestration. I propose a coalition of private firms to start a disciplined cap and trade institution. They would establish a standard for green certification where a business gets certified only if all its suppliers also buy emissions permits. The cap and trade would use a state-of-the-art auction mechanism with a target date to end global warming. This mechanism eliminates the management uncertainty associated with global warming. The institution would have a cadre of scientists and uncompromising lawyers to set uniform standards for sequestration contracts, and a whistleblower mechanism to incentivize truth-telling. The approach still has some problems to sort out, but they seem surmountable compared to getting a disciplined international treaty. So this is a call to CEOs for action. A half dozen willing captains of industry could put this together in a few months. They don't need an international treaty. It would have an effect immediately, and participation would probably spread quickly through the global supply chains. Thank you so much for listening.